What's up, everybody? If it sounds like Ruckus is wrestling a raccoon in the closet, that's because I'm sitting here watching quite a storm going on outside, and I'm glad most of it is to the north of me. It was dumping buckets there for a minute. Continuing on with this 1671 book, we've got some accounts in here of a journey up the Great North River, which I believe is the Colorado River. And this book is written by an Englishman, John Speed, and he is talking about an expedition of the Spanish that they took. But I'm not sure that it gave a date of when this expedition took place. From what I can gather, I would say they maybe made it 100 miles up the river, which is around Yuma, Arizona, probably. Maybe as far as Blythe, which is another 50 miles or so upriver. And you can see they still refer to this as Cibola National Wildlife Refuge. Cibola being a very old name for this area. Now, I've been through here and there's all kinds of agricultural land on each side of the river, which I always assumed was done by, modern Westerners. Kind of have the same thing down in Yuma and a few other spots where the valley really opens up and there's good arable land there. But according to this book, this area had been settled and farmed for who knows how long before the Spanish came. They do make mention of Lake Conibus, but it is 800 miles up to there. And they say there was a huge town up there, 7 leagues long, which is like 25 miles. But I don't think any of the Spanish saw it with their own eyes. I haven't found any mention of this expedition in the history books, but they did mention running into people that had contact with Coronado's expedition, and they erected 3 crosses on a hill there. Coronado went by the Grand Canyon. There's a mountain range named for him there. But between his first expedition in around 1550 up until the 1800s, there was only a handful of Westerners that even traveled the western states. Going by the official accounts of things, evidently, there were people everywhere when the first Spanish arrived, but then by 1800s, the country was practically empty, and they say it was because they had brought over diseases that wiped everybody out. But this expedition says that there were villages of like 15,000 people, and then you go another 20 miles and there's another couple villages of 20,000 people. So it's way different than the hunter-gatherer image of things that we were taught in school. They even mentioned 4- and 5-story houses. But spoiler alert, I think we're talking about something much more like this. Though they do say that they were made of stone and lime. And basically, it talks of a much more advanced culture than academia or our educational system would lead you to believe, but a lot less advanced than YouTube picture looker adders would have you believe. I'm not going to get into it, but this is European style architecture, and this is American style architecture, which I think could have possibly extended up into California and the American West at one time and got wiped out. A really weird thing I've been, thought about for years is, why are there no megaliths in North America? They are literally found everywhere else around the world, even out on tiny little Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific. But there are no megalithic structures in North America. Why is that? Well, I think it's because North America got wiped out in a big way. Now, one thing that this book does show is that the climate was much different back at this time in the 1500s. I'm going to start off with their description of Sinaloa, which is right here, just south of the Great North River, which is undeniably a desert region today. The mouth of the Colorado River, or the Great North River, is right here. And once again, if they made it that far, it seems like they would have found that California was connected to the mainland. So it may not have been at that time. I don't know. That's still stretching the bounds of what's possible in my mind, but hey, could have been, like I said in the last video, it all just collapsed. But here's what they say about Sinaloa. They say it was a very fertile land, just like the rest of Mexico. They grew a lot of cotton here, and that it is exceedingly well watered with rivers. Just so you know, this is the area we're talking about, and it looks like this for 1,000 miles to the north, 500 miles to the south in present day conditions. They say here, but Guzman, traveling up 27 leagues along the aforementioned river Tamacola, came to the province Sinaloa, where they stayed 6 weeks by reason of the abundance of rains. So this sounds like a monsoon season basically in Southern California and northern Mexico, that general area. So they had to hunker down for 6 weeks, at which time the villagers provided them with turtle doves, hares, rabbits, and all sorts of fowls. But at last they deserted their habitations in the night. That is a common theme among the Spaniards. They would travel around with their shiny helmets and their shiny crosses, and the locals would be nice to them, show them hospitality, give them food, and then they would overstay their welcome every time. I mean, this is just about every expedition I've ever heard of. And eventually the locals would find out they're just a bunch of freeloaders that apparently weren't doing any work or helping out in any way, and then they'd sneak off in the middle of the night. I just watched a video like 2 days ago of them still doing this in the 1700s. So they were a far cry different than the Quakers and the other Protestants that came and actually homesteaded. And don't buy all the crap that they're pushing today about the Western G side of North America. No, everybody kind of settled together for a long time, and then there were very few in the Gov that screwed all that up. That's a whole other story. So New Mexico is bounded on the southwest with New Biscay, more directly westward, with some parts of Quivira, the country's northward of it, not yet discovered. Eastward, it extends itself as far as Florida. Now, at this time, what they called Florida extended all the way into Texas, Oklahoma, possibly the eastern half of Colorado. And basically, New Mexico was the western half of the continent. And they don't even know how big this is yet. This province, doubtless for largeness, may compare with New Galicia, Mexico, having been searched and discovered by the Spaniards above 100, some say 200 leagues directly eastward and to the northeast. And they report wonders of it, if we may believe them. Now, like I said, this is written by an Englishman off of Spanish accounts. Now, you know how I said earlier that the official history is they first showed up and there were millions of people everywhere. And then 100, 200 years later, people start coming to the same areas and it's basically empty. So did disease wipe everybody out, or were they lying in the first place? I mean, if you found an entire continent that was ripe for the picking and hardly anybody living there, would you go tell everybody else that, hey, there's nobody living over here? Yeah, beautiful rivers, lush valleys, fertile soil, and nobody's there. Or would you tell everybody else that it's full of 10-foot tall monsters that eat men if they see you? So there is the possibility that virtually everybody was wiped out in the 1300s catastrophe. Even modern anthropologists confirm that all of the cliff dwellings were abandoned around 700 years ago. The Mississippian culture in the Mississippi River Valley was wiped out 700 years ago. And I still think that these cliff dwellings are the survivors of the bigger culture that used to be here. These are the people that went up into the mountains where it's high and dry and hid from everything else that was going on. So the Spanish could have embellished parts of their stories of what they found when they first showed up here. But in respect of what was generally found in these northern parts of America at their first discovery, as namely that they have towns fairly and well built of lime and stone, houses of 4 stories high. And when they say houses of lime and stone, I think they're talking about a concrete mortar where you take limestone and bake it, then it crushes really easy after that, and you have your Portland cement, which is another one of those things that either this technology was taught to man by the gods, or all of these cultures have the same origins, therefore the same technologies, or both, but it's not intuitive to go burn limestone and make concrete. But anyway, the Spanish report towns fairly and well built of lime and stone, houses of 4 stories high, and most of them provided with stoves for the winter season, as well as any in Europe. Now, I know the Spaniards were supposed to have been blown away by how majestic Tenochtitlan was, but here they're describing houses as nice as any in Europe in New Mexico. The streets fair and broad, and the peoples as curious and expert in diverse arts and manufactures as any of theirs in Europe. More particularly, they tell us of a town called Chia of the province of Quams. I couldn't find exactly where that was. So big that it is said to contain 8 several marketplaces. Another called Acoma, a great town, but seated on top of an high rock, without any ordinary way of access to it, but by a pair of stairs hewn out of the hard stone, or else by certain ladders which the inhabitants let down and take up as they please. So Acoma is still there, and it's just like they described it. So at least part of this is true, and they weren't just making it up. But there's no remains along the Colorado River of villages of 15 to 20,000 people like they describe in here. And likewise of a third city, which is called Conibus. This is the Lake Conibus area, containing, as they say, no less than 7 leagues in length, which is about 25 miles, and about half so much in breadth, seated upon a lake, Lake Conibus, but scatteringly built. So it wasn't Manhattan style, everybody just building on top of each other. They left a little room in between the houses and just went for a really long ways. And much of the space taken up with mountains and many fair gardens. So with the present day desert conditions up there where Lake Conibus was, it seems like the remnants of this town would be there, but apparently nobody's ever found them. But I don't know that anybody's ever looked. If it's 150 miles across this thing, then you're talking 400 to 500 miles of coastline. But according to them, the 3 main towns to speak of were Chia, which I don't know where it's at, Acoma, which is right about here, and then Conibus on Lake Conibus. But we'll just kind of breeze through their expedition here, and it sounds like there were people living all over the American West at this time, which was not the case by 1800s. So 2 of the main leaders of the expedition was a monk called Bernardin Beltran and Antony Esperius, who spent a great part of his estate in railing of men. So he's the one that financed this expedition. And here they're describing natives who went naked, lived in huts. So there's primitive and more advanced people that they're speaking of. And we'll get to one part that's much more advanced than what I had in mind. So some of the more primitive were amazed at the crosses which the Spaniards erected until they were informed of a crucified Savior. And they said, no, I'm out. And I'm kind of skipping parts of their journey. Otherwise, this would get really long. But conducted 22 leagues further, which that's 60, 70 miles. They came amongst the Indians called Passaguates of the like constitution with the Conchis, which were somewhat primitive, who had skill in minerals and judged that there were many silver mines in that country. They escorted them to the borders of Las Tabosas, and they no sooner saw them but fled because years before that they had been miserably dealt with by the Spaniards who had come earlier. They're talking about Coronado's expedition. Traveling on, they reached a place inhabited by a people richly clothed who also seemed to have some knowledge of God. For in their discourse, they pointed up to heaven, called the creator and preserver of all things Apollo? I don't know. But they signified that they had received that knowledge formerly from those that were left of Pamphilus Narvaez's army, who having ranged through Florida were driven hither. Now, I looked up Narvaez's army, and it's just referencing this book that I'm reading. So apparently there are a lot more explorers that didn't make the history books, because this seems to be the only place on the internet that this Pamphilus Narvaez exists. So they traveled another 30 miles through a wilderness of pine trees and eventually made it back down to the River del Norte, the Great North River. And the banks of the rivers on each side was planted with nut trees and vines, which spread themselves out above 3 leagues. So they basically had 7 miles of orchards going along this river. It sounds like an awesome place to have lived. They then saw 10 populous villages pleasantly seated on said river, from whence came many thousands of the natives to meet Esperius, who was not so much amazed at the great number of people as at their extraordinary civility and decent habits, for they entertained him with well-dressed meat, roasted poultry, and pleasant fruits. Their garments were cotton cloaks, deerskin breeches, shoes, and boots of good leather. Now, that's another apparent technology of the gods, is where did man learn to weave? A loom is a pretty advanced piece of machinery if you think about it. And there's nothing intuitive about taking a fluffy piece of cotton and spinning it into a string and then running it through this and making up textiles. Yet the original Native Americans were wearing cotton cloaks, which meant that they knew how to do all this. The women wore their hair neatly combed and pleated. Their houses were almost 4 stories high, handsomely built, and divided into fair chambers, had stoves or cells underground against the cold in winter. Every village was governed by a cazique. I see this word quite a bit. I think it's like a chief, whose commands were published by somebody. Each house had a peculiar place in which their idol stood, before whom they set meat twice a day. That's another thing that's just not intuitive, to carve yourself an idol and start worshiping it for no reason, yet it's ubiquitous throughout the ancient world. Near the highways, so they had roads going from town to town, stood temples very curiously painted, wherein their deity, as they say, diverted himself in his progress from one village to another. At certain distances near their plowed lands stood porticos supported on 4 columns, under which the husbandman used to eat and take his noon sleep. So they had agriculture. They'd go work the fields in the morning. Then when it gets hot, eat something, take a nap. But this is what got me. Besides their swords, which were strong enough to cut a man through the middle, they used bows and arrows. So out here in the middle of nowhere, modern New Mexico desert, they had swords? So I remember a story of a guy that was wanting to trade with the Native Americans up in the Northeast, like Algonquin territory, but he couldn't find the natives, and he asked somebody how to find them, and he said, well, you take that, I think it was like a brass or bronze hatchet that he had. He said, you go out in the woods, you hang it from a tree, and then go back in a week, and you'll find the Native Americans. And sure enough, he did it. They were still there wondering where this metal came from. But they're saying here out in the desert Southwest, they had swords. So I don't know. I almost think this has to have been from trading with other Europeans. Aztec built whole cities and pyramids, and they didn't have swords. They had obsidian that they stuck in wood, you know? So that just really threw me off when he said that they had swords. I guess I'm just easily impressed. But moving on, we'll just show you how populated some of this area was. Jutting against Cibola, in which he found 11 villages inhabited by above 14,000 people, who were clad in skins and cotton, worshipped many idols, and received the Spanish with great civility. The like entertainment they met with in the country of Las Quieres, washed by the river del Norte, near which stood 5 villages inhabited by about 15,000 people. Now, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff here, but there's about 10 different places along the Great North River, the Colorado River, that they say is inhabited by 20,000 people, and these aren't even the big cities. There's the Chia, Acoma, and Conibus that are the big cities. So it sounds like the American Southwest was very well populated in the 1500s. But then by the 1800s, when Westerners really started flowing into that area, it was basically just the Apaches and Comanches, who were nomadic hunter-gatherer types. Well, just look at Chaco Canyon. It's just drier than dry out there today. But at one time, they say that 30 to 40,000 people lived here. Under present day conditions, there's no way you could sustain a population like that there. Now, I've only got that one example of the climatic shift, but what I said earlier about Sinaloa and them being stuck in the rain for 6 weeks straight, that's a monsoon season. So I think you had completely different climatic conditions here 500 years ago. As in, this wasn't a desert. This was arable land at that time. So anyway, like I said, there's no earth-shattering discoveries here, but it was very different 500 years ago here. And apparently way more civilized than a few hundred years later. Oh yeah, and it didn't always pay to be a gold-digging Spaniard, since they continually overstayed their welcome and wore out their hospitality and were only interested in gold. At one point, the natives actually just took one of the Spanish and poured liquid gold down his throat. What's really interesting here is how they portray the natives, though. They look like a bunch of little bald European guys. Anyway, that's what was happening out in the West 500 years ago. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.